What happened in Oman on May 11, 2026, could reshape the Middle East immediately, not gradually, not over decades, but now. The framework reportedly agreed upon represents a dramatic reversal for the Islamic Republic of Iran, a state that built its identity over 47 years on resistance to the United States, the same government that called America the Great Satan and defined itself through opposition to Western influence, is now reportedly considering terms that would suspend its nuclear enrichment program, surrender its stockpiles of 60% enriched uranium, accept SNAP inspections at all facilities, and reopen the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for sanctions relief. This is not merely another diplomatic development, it represents a profound strategic and ideological shift. For the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps IRGC, whose authority has long been tied to the narrative of resistance and national survival, such concessions would amount to an extraordinary retreat from the principles it claimed were non-negotiable. According to reporting from Axios, negotiations in Oman, Geneva, and Islamabad include discussions of a nuclear enrichment moratorium lasting at least 12 years, with the United States reportedly pushing for 15 years. After that period, Iran would only be permitted to enrich uranium to 3.67%, the civilian level established under the 2015 JCPOA. Iran would also reportedly agree not to operate underground nuclear facilities such as Fordow, accept expanded IAEA inspections, and allow comprehensive verification measures. Perhaps most significantly, sources familiar with the talks claim Iran has discussed removing its stockpile of highly enriched uranium from the country entirely, with one proposal involving transfer to the United States. Iran's estimated 400 kilogram stockpile of 60% enriched uranium, long viewed by Western analysts as the most alarming component of its nuclear program, would therefore leave Iranian territory altogether. Omani foreign minister described the discussions as unprecedented, stating that Iran had agreed to zero stockpiling of enriched uranium. Existing stockpiles, he said, would be downblended and converted into fuel in a way that could not easily be reversed. He emphasized that the central objective was ensuring Iran would never ever possess nuclear material capable of producing a bomb. For the IRGC, the implications go beyond nuclear policy. The nuclear program has long served as the core justification for the organization's political dominance, economic influence, and security apparatus. The official argument was consistent for decades. Iran faced an existential threat from the United States and Israel. The nuclear program was essential for deterrence, and only the IRGC could guarantee national survival. That narrative was used to justify economic hardship, political repression, and violent crackdowns on dissent. Now, many Iranians are confronting a difficult conclusion. After years of sacrifice, sanctions, inflation, and repression carried out in the name of resistance, the state appears willing to compromise on the very issue it once portrayed as sacred and untouchable. To critics of the regime, this suggests that the sacrifices demanded of the population were ultimately about preserving power rather than preserving national survival. The domestic consequences are already visible. The protests that spread across Iran in late 2025 did not disappear. They evolved underground after severe repression. What was once driven primarily by economic frustration and anger over political restrictions may now be reinforced by a growing perception that the regime abandoned its core ideological commitments when the cost of maintaining them became too high. Opposition figures and reformist voices inside and outside Iran have interpreted the negotiations as evidence that the current political order is weakening. Former President Hassan Rouhani described the moment as an opportunity to rebuild the foundations of government. Nobel Peace Prize laureate Shirin Ebadi called for accountability within the IRGC leadership. Reza Pahlavi urged continued civil resistance. Meanwhile, divisions inside the Iranian establishment appear to be deepening, with hardline factions reportedly resisting concessions, while more pragmatic officials push for a settlement to prevent further economic collapse. This internal fracture may explain why negotiations repeatedly appear close to breakthrough before stalling again. American officials have acknowledged concerns that Iran's leadership is deeply divided, with elected representatives and security institutions pursuing conflicting agendas. The pattern suggests not a unified state negotiating from a coherent position, but a government struggling internally over whether compromise itself represents survival or surrender. Every drone strike on the UAE during the ceasefire was an act of sabotage. Every ballistic missile fired at Kuwait during negotiations was sabotage. Every IRGC commando operation targeting Bubiyan Island was sabotage. The IRGC is not conducting these operations to strengthen its negotiating position. It is trying to prevent an agreement altogether, because an agreement would force the organization to acknowledge that the nuclear program it spent decades defending was never worth the price Iran paid for it. The central structural problem identified even in White House assessments is this: there are effectively two Irans negotiating simultaneously, and they want fundamentally different outcomes. Only one of them may be capable of signing an agreement that the other will actually honor. President Masoud Pezeshkian's government, which understands exactly what economic collapse would mean for 88 million people, wants a deal. It has reportedly struggled to gain access to a supreme leader increasingly insulated by IRGC influence. It has fought over cabinet appointments imposed by the security establishment. And Pezeshkian himself has described IRGC operations as catastrophic, irresponsible, and madness, language unprecedented from an Iranian president toward the Revolutionary Guards in the modern history of the Islamic Republic. Pezeshkian's administration will likely sign an agreement if the IRGC allows it. The IRGC, however, sees the agreement differently. From its perspective, a deal would represent the formal end of the strategic project that justified its institutional dominance for nearly half a century. The organization's preferred outcome is not necessarily victory, it is stalemate, keeping the Strait of Hormuz as leverage, preserving whatever remains of the nuclear infrastructure after the Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan strikes of 2025, and maintaining the IRGC's structural power inside the Iranian state, even while the broader economy deteriorates. Because once the nuclear deterrent disappears, the IRGC loses the central argument it used to justify everything else it controls. But the deeper issue, and perhaps the one the IRGC has not fully processed, is that the Iranian public may no longer be willing to absorb the cost of that strategy indefinitely. The protests that spread across Iran from late 2025 into 2026 were not driven primarily by abstract ideological demands. They were driven by collapsing living standards, wiped out savings, food insecurity, and the memory of relatives killed during crackdowns. 7 million people facing hunger is not a foundation for long-term stability. Inflation above 100% is not an environment that sustains passive political acceptance. A currency that has lost roughly 97% of its value is not a reliable basis for financing military operations, paying security personnel, or maintaining patronage systems. That is why the IRGC is not truly choosing between deal and no deal. It is choosing between compromise and the kinds of economic and social conditions that historically generate revolutionary crises. This possibility is no longer confined to opposition rhetoric. Major policy institutions, including the Council on Foreign Relations, the Atlantic Council, and Foreign Affairs, have all recently explored whether the Islamic Republic, in its current form, can survive the accumulating pressures of economic collapse, internal division, and strategic isolation. Signs of institutional stress are increasingly visible. Iranian diplomats have reportedly sought asylum abroad rather than return home. Officials are allegedly moving funds overseas. Reports have circulated of IRGC personnel facing delayed salaries, deteriorating living conditions, and shortages severe enough that some are purchasing food themselves. Any security apparatus that struggles to sustain its own forces begins approaching the practical limits of coercive control. The Strait of Hormuz remains the central strategic pivot around which everything else turns. Before the conflict, roughly 3,000 vessels per month moved through the corridor. Current traffic estimates reportedly place that figure near 5% of normal volume. The economic consequences are global. Asian economies dependent on Gulf energy have experienced shortages, while the International Energy Agency's member states released hundreds of millions of barrels from emergency reserves to stabilize markets. The balance of power embedded in the current negotiations is visible in the shipping data itself. Whoever controls access to Hormuz controls leverage over energy markets, inflation, logistics networks, and political stability far beyond the Middle East. And that is why the negotiations in Oman are not simply about uranium enrichment or sanctions relief. They are about whether the Islamic Republic can preserve its current structure while surrendering the strategic doctrine that justified it for 47 years. Fire was opened on the vessel only after it reportedly ignored multiple warnings. Meanwhile, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi in Beijing and explicitly called for the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. That demand was not framed primarily as solidarity with Iran, but as a strategic necessity for China itself, the country whose energy security and Belt and Road investments are deeply tied to uninterrupted Gulf shipping. When Beijing openly pressures Tehran to reopen the very waterway Iran has long treated as its ultimate strategic leverage, the geopolitical landscape changes fundamentally. The IRGC's worldview was built in the context of 1979, resistance against the United States, revolutionary isolation, and regional deterrence through asymmetric pressure. It was not built for a world in which China, Iran's most important economic partner, views prolonged disruption in Hormuz as unacceptable. The terms reportedly under negotiation, a 12 to 15-year moratorium on enrichment, automatic extensions in the event of violations, expanded inspections, and permanent restrictions on underground facilities, are not simply a nuclear compromise. They amount to the dismantling of the strategic architecture the IRGC spent decades constructing. A moratorium lasting more than a decade does more than pause centrifuges. It disperses expertise. Scientists move on. Institutional continuity erodes. Infrastructure damaged in the 2025 strikes on Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan remains unreconstructed because the agreement itself prohibits the restoration of underground enrichment facilities. Continuous IAEA access and SNAP inspections would sharply constrain covert rebuilding efforts. And transferring the stockpile of highly enriched uranium out of Iran would place the program's most strategically valuable material permanently beyond immediate reach. From the IRGC's perspective, this is not a temporary suspension, it is a strategic rollback on a generational timescale. That is why the language emerging inside Iran matters so much. Reports that even state-affiliated media used the word surrender to describe aspects of the framework are politically explosive. Surrender is the one outcome the IRGC spent decades insisting would never happen. The one outcome it claimed justified sanctions, repression, sacrifice, and confrontation. Now, many Iranians are confronting a deeply destabilizing conclusion. They were told economic hardship was necessary for resistance, yet the resistance itself now appears negotiable. They were told dissent endangered national survival, yet the state is now discussing terms that would have once been denounced as impossible capitulation. They were told there was no alternative to sacrifice, only to watch the leadership pursue compromise once the strategic and economic costs became unbearable. That combination, ideological retreat, public disillusionment, and accumulated economic suffering, creates a dangerous political environment for any authoritarian system. History shows that regimes built around narratives of permanent sacrifice face severe legitimacy crises when they abandon the very principles used to justify decades of control. The signs of strain inside Iran are increasingly visible: rooftop chants, renewed protests, asylum requests from diplomats, growing capital flight, and public frustration fueled by inflation, sanctions, and collapsing living standards. These are not isolated events. Together, they suggest an erosion of confidence not merely in specific policies, but in the credibility of the governing structure itself. The central question now is not whether the Islamic Republic is under pressure. It clearly is. The real question is whether the system can transform itself fast enough to survive the contradictions exposed by the Oman negotiations, or whether internal fractures between elected officials, the IRGC, and the public will deepen into something far more unstable. What happens in the final negotiating rounds, and whether hardline factions inside Tehran attempt to block or sabotage the agreement, could determine whether this becomes a moment of controlled transformation or the beginning of a much larger systemic crisis inside Iran.